Okay, so we've established that the diseases could travel inland quite quickly. And there are many of these different types of diseases, and they could be carried regardless of whether someone actually had the disease at that moment. The disease could possibly even be carried in those cases, but there were about 22 different types of diseases. So let's talk about now the reports going back to Europe. So when meeting some peoples, remember, Europeans eventually became fascinated by what was going on in the Western Hemisphere and by Indians. And certainly, in most cases, they're going to be reporting to their superiors what they found, and the superiors would, in turn, send the stories back to Europe, where they would then become knowledge among the people in Europe. At one point, getting into the 1500s, the printing press, which by then had been around since 1450, long enough that now there were magazines and books starting to be distributed, and people were interested in reading, and one of the subjects they were most interested in reading was about Indians. So the reports going back to someone's superiors and eventually back to Europe, to the king and queen and to the various people who were interested in the information. So a person could come to a town that had been depopulated 5 years, 10 years before, even 20 years before, and this was a common scenario, not necessarily known or realized at the time, and not known or realized completely until just recently, how common of a scenario that would be, to come to a town that had been partly depopulated. Now you could picture with these reports going back to superiors and eventually back to Europe, where they had this voracious appetite for American stories, how the image of the American Indian would get off to a start that wasn't very good. These Stone Age tribespeople type of fallacies. And imagine what might happen if you came to a town that had been depopulated 20 years ago down to, say, 5% level. Well, imagine a town wiped out to 5%. And the neighboring towns probably wiped out the same way. So you would have children fending for themselves and growing up without a sense of culture at all, possibly forced alliances with their neighbors. A lot of the infrastructure not really in place anymore, the hunting, the growing of food, things being taught. Children growing up without a real sense of someone there to teach them. So they've realized how quickly the disease spread inland, and this contact was moving, diseases were moving faster than the contact was, basically is what we're looking at. So it was possible to meet groups that had already been impacted by the disease. And that's the second part of that puzzle.